Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another Friday SLO Talk. Before we move on with today's topic, I just would like to remind everyone that the format of the talk is such that you are always welcome to participate in the discussion. Please make sure that if you wish to ask a question, you can always use the chat. You can post your question on the Padlet that we are going to post in just a minute in the chat. Please make sure that if you would like to speak to us physically, raise your hand. Let one of us, one of the coaches, myself or Amanda, let us know, and we'll be happy to let you speak. Another logistics reminder is that all talks are recorded, and that's probably the most commonly asked email that I get after the conversations throughout the week. People just say, "I couldn't make it. Where is the recording?" So we sent the recordings on the flyer, and they are all there. We also have a blog and a YouTube channel. If you can't find links to those, please don't hesitate to let me know. But if you have received a flyer with information about Friday SLO Talks, all the recordings are there on the bottom, at the bottom of the flyer. Good morning again. Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Jarek. I am from Santa Ana College in Southern California. I'm the founder of the Friday SLO Talks. And I'm here joined by Amanda Tater, one of the colleges. Amanda, would you please say hello?
Hello, I am the SLO coordinator at Reedley College, which is in the Central Valley of California.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for joining us. And if you have any questions throughout the talk, please don't hesitate to send us a message, contact us somehow, and we'll be happy to accommodate your request for conversation, address your question. This semester, all Friday SLO Talks are tackling an aspect of artificial intelligence and how it impacts higher education. Today's talks are not exceptions. We have two fantastic presentations all the way from South Africa. Joining us is Mrs. Elmien van Amerom and Mrs. Tho-Marie Stoltz, and Dr. Will Miller, who is going to be starting his talk in about an hour. He's joining us from a more local location, which is Florida, still quite away from Southern California, where I am. So I'm just so very pleased to see this variety of locations, and I'm sure perspectives and expectations. Welcome again for joining us. We will start with the South African team because of the time difference. You know, we don't want them to be going to bed too late tonight. So thank you again for joining us. Please, Mrs. Amerom and Mrs. Stoltz.
And thank you very much for the opportunity. It's really for us a very wonderful opportunity to go and share something which is of great passion to us. So again, thanks. Our title for our session is Unveiling the Dance. We call it a dance, and we'll tell you why, what that is about. And it's about navigating learning taxonomy literacy through ChatGPT and Bloom's revised taxonomy. I'm quite passionate about Bloom's revised taxonomy since it's also part of my PhD, which I'm busy finalizing. And it is something which over the years I've studied, I've seen so many interesting facts roaming around. I also see a lot of interesting pictures, people trying to represent how Bloom's revised taxonomy should look like. And I've realized over the years that there's also a lot of junk out there, to be just, purely blunt. So a two-folded purpose for our session is my passion is to reinstate the truth about Bloom's taxonomy. And then another passion of my colleague sitting next to me here, Tho-Marie, is to promote the scholarly use of ChatGPT when you use Bloom's revised taxonomy to interpret your learning outcomes and your question items. So I've got a little disclaimer there at the bottom saying that this session is actually merely an appetizer for the truth. And it's a desire to learn about the empowering potential of Bloom's taxonomy. Because if you understand this beast quite well, it is becoming like a lamb to you in the end. So the trick is to try and understand how it works, what you can do with it, what you should not do with it. That's basically what this entails. So we're going to kickstart our session by with one little question here, asking you to vote there which of the following books on the so-called Bloom's taxonomy have you yourself actually read and actually studied. So on the left, I've got the different editions of Bloom's taxonomy. You can maybe just scan the code and then maybe just indicate to us which of those editions you've actually read, actually studied. Let's see, it looks very interesting coming in. We've got approximately 142 participants. And I'm looking at the stats there, the number of people that have actually read and actually studied. 6 people, the 1956 edition, 2 people, the 2001. I think now the 56 edition goes up to 7. A breached edition, 5 people. And the 2014 publication, 4 people. And then none of the above, we've got a couple. And then obviously there are lots of other people that haven't had the opportunity yet to vote. So it's quite clear to us, which is something I expected, that very few people have actually read it and actually studied the books. And I think it might also be very interesting to you tonight to see about all the other possible editions that actually do exist. Now, we also plan to share with you tonight Prof. Lauren Anderson, one of the authors of the book, who's still alive and who were interviewed by the Association for Cultural Development on what he says about the Bloom's taxonomy. I was so glad when I came across these video interviews, because that helped me to strengthen my case as well, to hear it from the horse's mouth, what he says, what the purpose actually is supposed to be with Bloom's and what not. So thank you very much for participating here with us. Moving on to our next slide, I'm asking kind of like rhetorical questions. How aware are you that Bloom's taxonomy was never cast in stone? That right from the 1956 version, there was an invitation in the book. You'll see here, I've got Bloom, Hastings, and Madhouse, 1971. It was in Bloom's handwriting himself saying that actually he encourages that this taxonomy be taken and that it be adapted to your specific discipline. It's interesting here, Prof. Lauren Anderson himself in the 2001 version saying the original group always considered the framework a work in progress, neither finished nor final. Interestingly enough, also in the complete edition of the 2001 book, it's interesting there where Bloom and a couple of his colleagues, they also investigated 19 other learning taxonomies. They compared it and then found actually the following thing. So I just want to quickly share with you this. They found that all authors of the alternative frameworks sought either to improve on the original framework, that's Bloom's one, or to devise another easier one to use. 6 of these frameworks they investigated all used verbs. And it's interesting because if you look at the 2001 version, they changed the nouns, which was, if I remember correctly, it was knowledge, comprehension, understanding, analysis, etc. And then in the 2001 version, they changed it to verbs. And you know what the reason was? It's because that's the way that faculty and teachers wrote their learning outcomes. So, and these other frameworks also followed it on the same trend. Interestingly enough, they also said here that the other frameworks also either explicitly or implicitly made knowledge a separate dimension, following from the original Bloom's taxonomy. And another thing interesting also, they also include synthesis, which is what Bloom's call change to create. And they all had that as their top category. So basically what they did was they kind of tested their taxonomy against all the others that started to come out there. And some of the interesting ones that they already compared back then was the solo taxonomy, which is something that I think a lot of people know. Well, I assume so. And the other one is Marzano's taxonomy. Already back then was compared with Bloom's taxonomy, and they found a lot of similarities. Hence me saying that it's been used as a heuristic framework. Something else is, which I got from an article by Anderson and Sosniak, is saying that there's a lot of secondary source reliance on Bloom's taxonomy, saying that from their article, teachers are so busy teaching that they often get the information secondhand. And then something else, hence being busy with my PhD, and there's also secondary source bias. I still find research articles using the 1956 version of the Bloom's taxonomy, which tells me immediately that those researchers aren't aware that the taxonomy has moved from having one dimension to 2 dimensions, meaning that they don't only look at the cognitive processes, but they also look at knowledge, which is the result of our thinking. So that was very interesting to me as well. Now, these are the so-called, we call them, the two of us call them the great books of, and you'll see I call it the LTA taxonomy. And I'll tell you why. LTA standing for learning, teaching, and assessing. Now, if you look at the 1956 edition, that taxonomy was never really called Bloom's. It got popularized like that. And in one of the interviews, video interviews with Prof. Lauren Anderson, he kind of like sounds a little bit, you know, negative about that and a bit kind of despondent about that, because he says, you know what, guys, he was just merely the editor. That comes from one of his videos. It's actually called, back then it was called the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. So it's just interesting, by the something on the sideline that I just wanted to share with you. But now we know it as Bloom's taxonomy. And then in 2001, they made a bunch of changes, which I'm going to share with you as well. But they changed from only cognitive process to also having knowledge. But I'll also share something very interesting with you there about that. I'll talk to you a little bit about the so-called complete edition, the one that is a grayish color. And then the last one is not really a change from the 2001 version. It's merely a change of publisher. So when you put the book on the right next to the gray and the light brown one, it's exactly the same content, but just instead of Longman being the publisher, it's Pearson being the publisher. So that's the only change with that last book that we have. So looking at this first one, you will see there, Bloom had a bunch of people working with him. So on the left, I tried to show you, it was actually a committee of college and university examiners. That is one of the imprint pages of this book. And there you can see the people that contributed there as well. Down there, you'll see David Crathwell, one of his other editors that worked with him as well. Key principles of this taxonomy. It focused initially, the 56 version, on the classification of intended cognitive behavior. So do you hear behaviorism coming in strong here, very strongly? So back then, the taxonomy had one dimension, yes, of which they regarded knowledge as one of the levels. It was organized in a hierarchy, yes. It was arranged from simplest to most complex. And what was interesting, which I also got there, is that they never saw these categories as being in isolation, but they are interrelated. They gel together. And interestingly enough, also there, which I got directly from the book on page 15 there, you cannot use the taxonomy to classify a learning outcome using only the verb, for example, or using only one particular phrase in your learning outcome. Then you are going to map it completely the wrong way. And there at the bottom I had for you, it was never called Bloom's. It was actually, the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives. But let's not sweat that. The bottom line's taxonomy exists. But now moving on to the 2001 version, what was interesting there is we're going to play you just a very short video clip where you'll hear Prof. Lauren Anderson telling very interesting facts to you. So let's quickly listen to that.
That's true, and there's an interesting. We could get into this for days, because let me say two things. I'm going to go back to something you said earlier, and then I'll come back to this again.
Sure.
You said, they use the taxonomy to identify objectives. Okay, which is just wrong. That's just wrong.
Wow.
What you do, and let's go back to the original intent. Notice that the taxonomy people, okay, the people who were using the taxonomy didn't go to the instructors or professors with the taxonomy and said, here, use this to come up with your objectives. That's not what they did. What they did is to say, write your objectives and give them to us. So the objectives precede the taxonomy.
Right.
The objectives, and then you can analyze the objectives, or the one objective at a time, or a collection of objectives. So you can, any way you want to, using it, but it's an analytic tool. Okay, and Bloom was very, very careful in his when he wrote the first chapter of the book to say that he wanted this to be what he called value free. Okay, he didn't want people to sit down and have these big arguments that they ended up having of, oh, critical thinking versus rote learning. Oh, da 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 da. Those are different arguments. Okay, those are arguments that are important arguments to have, but you shouldn't bring the taxonomy into that discussion. The taxonomy is simply a classification system, which will say to you things like 80% of the items are knowledge items.
Nice.
It doesn't say they should be, they shouldn't be. That's a good thing. That's a bad thing. It just simply is a statement of fact. That's what they found. And when people start using the taxonomy to determine objectives, they're using it absolutely incorrectly. So that's the first,
All right, so that to me, you know, when you play that to audiences, it's sometimes quite a shocker for some of them. It's like, what? So that's what we were supposed to do and what we were not supposed to do. So it's actually an analysis tool. And just like Professor Lauren Anderson said there, it was not to make a judgment call of this is good or this is bad. It was merely to help you understand where you are at with your learning outcomes when you analyze it, or where you are at when you analyze your question items for that matter. What I liked about what he said is that taxonomy is value free, because what happened over the years is that people start to compare Bloom's with, oh, but it doesn't discuss critical thinking, or it doesn't include critical thinking. It doesn't include problem solving. It was never meant to do that, as Professor Lauren Anderson kind of like hinted towards. So when you scan this QR code, you'll get access to the full video where they've got lots and lots more stuff that they ask Professor Lauren Anderson about, which is absolutely amazing to hear from this man, you know, how you really are supposed to use this taxonomy. Here's the second edition. Let's say the 2001 abridged edition. There's a shortened one. I'll tell you what the complete one has, which the abridged edition doesn't have. But there are a couple of changes which is very nicely summarized in this book. And like I say, if you haven't read it, you won't know about these changes from the original framework to the revised framework. So we want you to just, again, another polling question for us. Look at these three figures and vote and tell us which one do you think is the most appropriate representation of Bloom's revised taxonomy? Looks like a little competition between figure 2 and figure 3.
I'm just going to close the QR code so that you can have once again just a look at the figures.
Very interesting. Figure 2. It's almost like the heat temperature here in South Africa. We've got a heat wave. We edge here at 40 degrees, 42 degrees. So we are really in a heat wave here. And that figure 2 looks like a heat wave to me, moving up and further up and further up. Very, very interesting. Thanks so much for your participation. And the answer to this is actually none. Not one of the options. Now, I know when we go onto the internet and we Google Bloom's revised taxonomy, we get this wonderful triangle. And you know what? When we look at another video, you'll hear what Prof. Lauren Anderson has to say about that. Because if you go into their book, nowhere will you find this triangle. And I even tried to find out, try to look at research articles, try to look at citations, try to look at where I can find information on who started with this triangle. But that is like a needle in a haystack. You just can't find it. It's just all that I even asked ChatGPT, and ChatGPT would just tell me, nope, it's a bunch of people, a bunch of educationalists, educational psychology people that came together and they just decided. So even Chat doesn't know. So the triangle was never ever meant to be there. We'll tell you actually what it's supposed to be. Yes, we can move on. Thank you. So here's another clip. Again, Alex Sala's asking Professor Lauren Anderson a couple of questions about this taxonomy. So just listen to these eye-opening comments.
But I am an advocate of any kind of analytic framework that enables us to develop a better understanding of the curriculum and what we believe to be important.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that's a great segue into dissecting some of the, let's say, misuses of the taxonomy. I mean, I think part of what you are experiencing and the problem that we have is that, from one perspective, I absolutely know for a fact, and anybody can do this, just go and Google any college. One thing is teacher programs are still basing their work out of the 1956 taxonomy, and they're also interpreting it, I think, in a wrong way. So one thing, a few questions I'm going to ask for you is, and for this, I think I'll share the screen and show you what I mean, because we have, first, you always get this, what's the whole thing with the pyramid, first of all?
Yeah. Well, the pyramid was for the original taxonomy. What the pyramid was attempting to do was to deal what they called a cumulative hierarchy. A cumulative hierarchy means that in order to get to the next step, you have to go through the step below it. So that knowledge is necessary for comprehension, comprehension is necessary for application, all the way up to evaluation. But the problem was, when we did the revision, that first of all, they shouldn't have used nouns, they should have used verbs, because that's the role that taxonomy played. It's not necessarily what knowledge they have, but how they remember the knowledge that they have, or how to comprehend the knowledge that they have. And it was a sad thing to do, because then all of a sudden people looked at that and said, well, knowledge is the least important. And that's simply not the case. If you look at it from the triangle point of view, knowledge is the building block of everything else. Without knowledge, there's no need to go any further, from the nouns to the verbs. And we really, and that's why this is not a good diagram. What we did was to make the triangle more of a rectangle. Okay, so that all of these became what I call tools in a toolbox, that sometimes you have to apply to understand. You don't understand before you apply. If you start to try things and all of a sudden you realize you don't understand. Okay, or you analyze to determine what the proper application is. And then after you apply, you evaluate to see whether or not the answer or the solution that you came up to makes sense. So rather than have this cumulative hierarchy, we had more of a rectangle that said to people, yes, there is an order to this, but the order is more complexity, that remember is less complex than understand, which is less complex than apply, which is less, and so forth and so on. But you don't need do this thing lockstep. That choose the kind of cognitive process that gets you where you want to go, that gets you to the objectives that you in fact set for yourself.
Great. So that's an important thing that you mentioned.
So when you look towards the right of the screen, you'll see there kind of like a three-dimensional model. And this was created, he's retired now. I tried to get hold of him, but he's decided no, he's going to hang up his boots. Rex here designed that from Iowa State University. And actually, like I said earlier, it was never supposed to be a triangle, but actually a matrix. And what I love about Rex here's model that he designed.
142.
And what I love about Rex here's model is, look at this. Factual knowledge, you can remember it, recall it. Factual knowledge, you can ask students to use factual knowledge and demonstrate understanding. Use factual knowledge and do application. Use factual knowledge to do analysis. Use factual knowledge to evaluate. And you can even create new factual knowledge. The same with the next one. I can ask a student all sorts of concepts, and I want them to maybe show the interrelationships between that concept, the conceptual knowledge. And I ask students to recall conceptual knowledge. I can also ask to demonstrate understanding, like maybe explaining it, or summarizing it, or inferring something. I can use conceptual knowledge also and do application. I can do analysis with conceptual knowledge evaluation. I can even create new concepts, I think, which is why you do a PhD, for example. The same with procedural knowledge. The same story. I can recall, understand, apply procedural knowledge, analyze, evaluate, and use my procedural knowledge also, and I can create new procedures. And then something interestingly was added over the years, and that was metacognitive knowledge. Now, that's what I love about AI. I know AI is not always maybe that good, but what I love about ChatGPT and all its other buddies, like Claude and like Bard and so forth, they've actually taken Bloom's taxonomy and turned it upside down on its head, saying to us now that the development of our students' metacognitive knowledge is now key. Have you ever wondered, you're in a class, you teach your students how to apply a particular procedure, and then exam comes, and you ask them to apply it, but now in a different situation, and they struggle. When you go and you do your research, you'll see that it is called metacognitive knowledge that they struggle with, because that's the knowledge that you use to help you with transference of your learning, to transfer it from one particular setting or situation to another situation or a setting. So when you do your class and you want to help your students develop their metacognitive knowledge, do you ever do something like the following? Let's say you are demonstrating in accounting, for example, the first in, first out method, or the last in, first out method to students, how it works. Do you ever talk out loud? And as you talk, you kind of like have a conversation with yourself. So I would say, okay, Elmien, the lecturer has now asked me to use the last in, first out method. So where will I start? Is there a formula? Okay, it says method. What does this method entail? So how will I go about, solving this problem that I've been given to use or to apply this method to? And out loud, you have like this conversation, you reason with yourself, and by doing that, you are demonstrating to students how to think when it comes to this particular method. Another question I always ask is, how often do your students speak accounting language or maths language or history language in class? That is where they are going to start to learn about what they don't know and what they do know well. A human being, us, we have to hear our thinking. We have to see our thinking. And that is where the metacognitive knowledge part comes in. So your students, how well do they know their own strengths and their own weaknesses when coming to an exam paper? Are they aware that maybe multiple choice questions is their strong point or weak point? That writing essays is their strong point or weak point? If they are aware of that, what do they do about that to help themselves get better? Do they go to you? Do they go to a tutor? Do they watch YouTube videos? What do they do to help them become better and better and better at that? So what I'm kind of like pleading for is that we start to focus, we do focus on factual knowledge and conceptual knowledge and procedural knowledge. We're good at that. But the metacognitive, that's something which has been neglected for years. And that's why I say, thank you, ChatGPT. Thank you, Bard. Thank you for coming into our lives, because you are now really grabbing the bull by the horns and you are shaking us and say, wake up. You'll have to teach your kids how to use their own learning strategies to become better, how to think about their thinking as well, so that they can gain what we as experts have, which is called conditional knowledge. And that is where I know when to use which particular method in which particular situation. That's something you gain over the years. Think of how many years our kids are at school. Can you imagine if we already there start to help them understand their thinking, so that by the time that they reach college or university level or wherever, that they are well equipped. Because if you go and you reach Prof. Paul Pintridge, also one of the co-workers here, says, it is just, he is amazed at when students arrive at college or university, how unaware they are of their own learning strategies and what works best and what they should not be doing, for example. All right, I can go on and on about this, but let me move on to the next one. So there, another thing that I wanted to show you as well is that behind remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create, those are 6 categories. But do you know what lies behind it? 19 cognitive processes. So behind remember, you've got recognition first, because that's easy. Think of a multiple choice question. You give all the options. You've done all the thinking for the student. The student has to kind of just recognize, search in here which one would match the best to the stem of that question. Now, if you go to recall, the one that's just behind that, which means it's deeper, it's a bit more complex, it's harder. So if I ask a student, what are the 5 most important reasons why businesses do planning? That would be harder than if I put it in a multiple choice question. I give them all the answers and they just have to pick the correct ones. So what I'm trying to tell you is that behind each of these categories, there's depth. And that's something that is missed a lot of the times. So the same with understand. Behind understand, you've got 7 different levels of complexity. The same with apply, the same with analyze, the same with evaluate, the same with create. I don't have time, unfortunately, tonight to show you that, but that is a whole workshop kind of that one can go through regarding that. Interesting there is Richard Mayer, which is another one of the co-workers there, also did an article where he wrote the next thing. He said, remember sees learning as knowledge acquisition. And if you focus a lot on students using factual knowledge and they have to recall it, then it means that you see learning as knowledge acquisition. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with it because we do need factual knowledge, but just that you know the difference. And then that promotes rote learning. Then Mayer said, if you look at from understand up to create, those categories focus on looking at learning as knowledge creation. So that's a different view. And what's interesting also, Richard Mayer says that from understand to create is what he's calling meaningful learning. So the student really engages with the material trying to make sense. Another interesting fact that he gives is that I know over the years people have spoken a lot about lots and hots, low order thinking skills, higher order thinking skills. There are even guys that have got lower order, the mid order, and the higher order. And if you read the article by Richard Mayer, you'll see that he actually says that actually we only have one lower order, and that's remember. Everything from understand upwards to create is higher order, in the sense of it's harder, it's more complex to do. Obviously, create is at the top because that's the ultimate motivation for a human, is to create. We love doing that. That's why they put that at the top. But think about this. I know as humans, we love to box things. But now, the moment I read that, it opened a whole new world to me, realizing that if I have understand questions, it's not that bad. It's actually hard. It's difficult. Because have you ever thought what explain means? Explain means you have to use a cause and effect mental model. That's quite complex to do. So don't think that if you've got understand questions, that's bad. No, no, no. It's already starting. It's starting at higher order. And as you move up, it becomes more complex and more complex and more complex. That's what I wanted to tell you there. So those blocks that Rex here has there is to kind of like illustrate that there's depth behind each of those 6 cognitive categories, and that there's also depth behind the 4 different categories of knowledge. Now I want to tell you something interesting. There was this perception that there wasn't really a knowledge dimension. But if you go back in the 1956 book, at the very back of the book, there's an appendix where knowledge is discussed in detail, all in detail. The only thing that changed from the 56 to the 2001 version is that the collaborators, the authors, they looked at the latest cognitive scientific research, they looked at cognitive learning theories, and they tried to incorporate that to move away from the behaviorism more towards the cognitive constructivist kind of movement that they have. So they moved away from that. And that's what I loved a lot about them. So here we just try to show you what we mean by depth. So if you look at understand, category 2, look at the depth there. You've got interpret, then you've got exemplify, a little bit more complex, classify, summarize, infer is harder, compare, and explain is even harder. So in your questions, you can play a lot in understanding with depth in your questions. Like I say, it opened a whole world, new world to me when I realized that. So understand has got, like you can see, 7 different levels of complexity, depth that we've got. That is fantastic news for someone that has to compile learning outcomes and question items. The changes in the emphasis there, were you aware that the 2001 version of Bloom's taxonomy was designed in such a way that it gives broader use? Originally, they focused a lot on assessment. Now it's also teaching and learning. It caters for a broader audience. Initially, it was higher education. Now it's school level as well. Now you know it, but I just wondered, were you aware? It's got a broader application. Originally, they focused a lot, obviously, test exam question items. Now you use it in teaching activities. You use it in your assessment tasks. And they emphasize the categories. Originally, the old 56 version focused so heavily on the 6 categories, and knowledge kind of like, got lost in the way. Now they've changed it. Now you've got 6 cognitive categories with 19 cognitive processes behind it, lying there behind it. And you've got your 4 knowledge categories with lots of types lying behind it. Powerful, powerful, powerful if you know how to use it correctly. There was changes in terminology as well. So what I wanted to show you here on the right-hand side is in the 56 version, look there already, all the detail about the different kinds of knowledge were already outlined there with examples, everything. So actually, it shouldn't be new to us. It's been with us since 1956. They changed the verb-noun relationship, but not really changed, but kind of emphasized it. So when you look at the learning outcome and you interpret it, we tend to, I don't know, I say we, the two of us, but here in my country, they tend to look at the verb, and then there's this handout, you know, with remember, understand, all these verbs listed underneath of each of these. And then people would go, okay, analyze, they would look, where does that verb fall, which column? Or let's say critique, look where it falls. It's under evaluate, and then they say it's evaluate, but think carefully. I can't just say critique X, Y, Z if I don't give you maybe a case scenario or a case study, because what am I going to critique? So what we found is people would just put a verb in there, and then they would just say, yeah, you know, it's evaluate, but they forget the complexity. Also, you must look what comes after the verb. That's what you interpret, not the verb alone, but what comes together with it. That's also something I've learned over the years working with this. I've already told you about the knowledge categories. The cognitive categories, they changed and replaced it with verbs. I also told you that. It's because when they investigated and they did the research, they found that teachers and faculty at university level, that's what they used when they wrote their, they've previously called it learning objectives, now learning outcomes, that's what they use. So they thought, okay, we'll have to speak the language of these people because they're our audience. Also, why they changed it to that is to be more representative of the cognitive processes that you find in cognitive theory and research. And then they changed comprehension to understand. This is their argument. Understanding is not something that stands in a sentence. It's something you achieve when you interact with the text. That was also very interesting to me. And I'm almost done. Changes in structure because before we move over to ChatGPT and the demonstration is that the nouns and the verb components have become separate dimensions because thinking is an active process. Hence, they use verbs. Knowledge is the result of thinking, hence the different types of knowledge that we have. The second point there, we already explained via the videos to you that we use it as an analysis tool. It's something that you can help to determine alignment between a learning outcome, a question item, between a question item and a model answer as well. That's something that people also tend to forget. And then look at this. Yes, in the old 56 version, it was like a hierarchy. But now in the 2001 version, it's not such a rigid cumulative hierarchy. They have proved through empirical studies that understanding, applying, and analyzing kind of go together. They could form a hierarchy. They also said that categories can overlap. So in one learning outcome, I can have more than one type of knowledge and more than one type of cognitive process. That's how good it could become eventually. Right, I've already told you the last point. And then I just wanted to tell you, if you ever want to get the complete edition, what I love about the complete edition, there you can go and read up how they compared their taxonomy, the Bloom's taxonomy, to the others. They also summarize and review empirical data that had an influence, you know, on the so-called assumed cumulative hierarchy. And chapter 17, for those of you that want to research further, I've got a bunch of golden gems in there about what they think could be done by researchers to make maybe a future revision. So maybe you are one of those wonderful people that will take Bloom to the next level, because we're in need of that, for sure. All right, that I already told you. So now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, and I want to leave you from my side with this message. Then she's going to show you the demonstration. Why in the world should I even worry about learning taxonomy literacy? Those are some of the reasons I could think of. Because you'll see ChatGPT, it knows some things. It still doesn't know Bloom that well because it was fed information, let me dare to say, by people who don't understand Bloom's taxonomy that well. And we're going to demonstrate that to you quickly to show you how we had to prompt this thing to get what we want. But obviously, because we know and understand the taxonomy well, we knew what to ask it because we could immediately spot where it went completely off the rails. Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. We're just quickly going to do a poll. We did both of these prompts on ChatGPT 3.5 as well as on 4, but we're going to demonstrate it tonight on 4. Can I just get an idea which of the two chats you are using? Are you using 3.5 or 4? Then you guys also see that there's a second QR code on the screen. There's also a Google form where I've listed all the prompts, so you can go and then also fill it in if you wish to, or you can get all the prompts there as well for after the session. Okay, so the majority of the audience tonight are then using 3.5. So I'm not going to waste any more time. I'm going to start now showing you what's the dance between prompting a chatbot and then how you can use blooms in your learning outcomes. So let's quickly start. So just good practice when you are using ChatGPT to always give it a role. Okay, so you can say that you're a teacher, a lecturer, a faculty member, an educational specialist. It depends on your role. Then I've prompted it first, asking it to explain the key elements of an excellent learning outcome and to provide me with a sentence template how chat will write in a learning outcome. And I will show that to you guys in the next slide. Also, when you do your prompting, also give a little bit of background information to chat as well about your type of student. I'm going to use a South African example here. Maybe it's grade 4, CAPS or the curriculum that we use, English home language, or it can be postgraduate students and the NQF or the university levels that we use. And 8 is then your first level after a degree. But we are going to go through all of these steps. Just to save time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but let's rather do it as we go through the demonstration. Okay, so this was the first prompt that I've asked him, the role that I've already explained, and then I've asked chat to define what is a learning outcome. So I started with baby steps, and here the dancing is already starting. So you need to use your knowledge, your conceptual knowledge to understand the information that he's providing you. Is it correct? Okay, so I was happy with his information. So I started with the next prompt. Then I asked, what are the key elements that a learning outcome sentence should contain, and also provide a sentence template. Then you guys can see here, I thought this is quite nice. It gave you a nice template. So sometimes it happens, I don't know, maybe you guys are lucky, but in our education system, especially in higher education, you will get learning outcomes, then it's not well developed. And a lot of lecturers don't have educational background, and they do struggle. They know it's wrong, but they don't know how to go and fix it. So this is quite a nice method for them then to go and rewrite their learning outcome if they wish to. It gives you a template then to work from. Once again, please verify what chat is saying. So that's the dance between you and chat then. Then the next prompt, I've asked to evaluate the following learning outcomes in a table format. I like tables. This is a personal preference. If you prefer paragraphs, then it's not necessary to say table format. Regarding the key elements that chat have identified in the previous prompt. And here you guys can see that I gave it some background so that it has context. Because it must also, when it's going to evaluate the learning outcome, make sure that it's on the correct level. Okay, so there you guys can see the 4 learning outcomes that I gave to chat. And then the answer. Then you guys can see that there, if I look at the first learning outcome in the block, performance criteria and context conditions, there were no information. Okay, so then I already knew just by a glance without reading through anything that this is not correct. So once again, we started to dance. and then I re-prompted chat to get more information. Okay, then I've asked him to go and rewrite the learning outcomes because I've already prompted it beforehand to use that template. So it gave me then better learning outcomes, and then I was satisfied with what it included, and then I've moved on. If it's still not correct, then you can keep prompting the chatbot up until you are satisfied, or just go and rewrite it depending on how much time and effort you want to put into it. Right, let's just move on. Then I've asked, can you please, I'm very polite, it's a bot, but please, it's still something that I use. Can you please rewrite the complete table, including the rewritten learning outcome 1 and 2? And then it was a better answer than the original one that it gave me. But you need to first verify before you move on with your prompting. If you're not satisfied, and something that I've also picked up, a silly question like, are you sure? Then it will correct itself as well. You can also try that if you discover that something was not correct. Then in the next one, yeah, I started now what Elmien spoke about. English is my second language, and sometimes it's very difficult to understand what a certain word, the definition is exactly. So yeah, it can help then also second language lecturers as well, who have asked the bot then, please go and identify all the types of nouns. I've done this steps quite a few times with chat. If you just put in nouns, it doesn't include all the types of nouns. So that's just a tip from my side. Then don't say common nouns, then it gives you common nouns. So rather use generic nouns. That's also just a tip from my side. And then the verbs. And once again, it did not give me all the information. Then I re-prompted the chatbot again. So we were dancing with each other. Right. Then here you guys can see that I've asked him that silly question. Are you sure there are no verbs for learning outcome 1, 2, and 3? And then you are correct. It was quite funny. So then he gave me all the verbs. I was satisfied, and I started with the next prompt. Okay. Then I asked him in a table, and I've included this because I've made a mistake here. You guys will see I didn't include in the first column the learning outcome. I only asked, give me the nouns, the verbs, the knowledge dimension, and the cognitive process dimension. And then after he was done, I realized, I've made a mistake. And then I just re-prompted it again. So on purpose, I've included that for tonight. So I've asked him start with the learning outcome, then the noun, the verb, and then the 2 dimensions. And we went through it, and we were quite happy with what the bot gave us, and then we moved on. Then we've asked it for the subtypes of cognitive process dimensions and knowledge dimensions. And here you guys can see it's this column, and then the last column then as well, where it gave me then the subtypes. Okay, and there you guys can see this is it's a very simple demonstration how you can use the chat by asking it quite specific questions, and then go and analyze your learning outcome. But the same type of questions or the same pattern of questions can also be used when you want to design a question item. So I've listed a few questions here for you, but they're also on that Google form sheet. I've included them there at the bottom as well for you. So once again, I will ask the chat, what are the key elements of an excellent question? Provide me a sentence template. Then I will ask from the learning outcome that the chat, the bot then already have identified. Identify the elements, what is constructive alignment? Make sure that the definition is correct. Then once again, put it in a table, and then you include once again all the elements of the Bloom's taxonomy. So it's exactly the same pattern that you will follow. And I think that we are there.
Thank you very much.
You have so many fantastic revealing thoughts and realizations. Mrs. Van Omeren, would you mind just one thing that struck me when you were talking about this shift or perhaps link from behaviorism or descriptors of behaviors to the cognitive dimension, if I haven't missed it, if this is correct. Would you just perhaps give a specific example of that, or how does it play out in Bloom's taxonomy? Because we are so used to the verbs, right? Those verbs that describe behavior, and we've gotten used to them, right? That this is, I can observe that. How does it play out in the context of your conversation?
I think that is why they brought in the knowledge dimension part that you have, because it's not just about the doing, it's also about the thinking, and that the thinking has actually an output, and that is your knowledge that you have. It's the result of your thinking. So realizing that, they realized that they had to make that a separate dimension to really get people to focus on not just measuring the doing part, but also concentrating on the thinking part that you have.
Right.
And I think that is why they had this shift, this move. So when you read it in their books, they also describe it like that was the biggest aha that they had when they looked at the 56 version. Perfect.
Thank you so much for this clarification. I'm really glad. And again, this is just fantastic presentation. Oh gosh, and the dense part with the chat, and really making sure that we are responsible for the answers that we are getting, that we create, and this very, very meaningful interaction and environment where we actually start interacting with the entity that we never had to deal with before. That's just absolutely amazing. So thank you very much, Ms. Stoltz, for those examples. This is just very, very revealing, and gosh, I think I'm going to watch it again tomorrow. Just the whole recording, just to internalize it, have time to think through some of the points that you are making. Excellent work. Anybody else?
Just have another
Vernon.
long list of sites to look up. Thank you.
Yes, Vernon has a question. Welcome, sir.
Oh, this is fantastic. Thank you so much for organizing this, and to the presenters. Just great stuff. One of the things that stood out to me that I hope you could talk a little bit more about is you talked about it's not necessarily necessary to move up in these complex steps. Sometimes, I think one of the things you said was sometimes they have to try to apply knowledge to sort of understand where they are at the understanding level. But then you mentioned, so that's really interesting to me. I think that's something worth thinking about in my own teaching and learning activities that I ask my students to do. I typically really try to scaffold from basic recollection, identify, and then move up in complexity. But you also mentioned something really interesting too, in terms of the meaningfulness of the outcome verb. And did you mean that in terms of like student engagement? As you move up in complexity, it becomes more meaningful. The learning becomes more meaningful for the students when they're, for example, maybe having to evaluate something. Is that what I hear you say? It's more meaningful. I think maybe that might be a way to retain student engagement more. It means more to them. It's more valuable to them. Is that how I should have interpreted what you said?
Yes, because learning is not something that you do in isolation. We learn from our peers a lot. And student engagement actually with That's why I say why I love chat. Actually, I hate it also, but I love it as well. It's like a love-hate relationship that I have with it. But it forces you to get more students engaged, in talking the language, maths, for example, in thinking the language, in hearing the language, in conversing with each other about this language. The moment that students start to do that, it's a whole different ballgame. Also, when our students do assignments, we encourage them in your Word and I think your PowerPoint and all, you've got that little thingy button that you can click read aloud. So when I did my literature chapters for my study, I would click that button and I would let it to read aloud what I have written. And when I heard what I wrote, it was like, oh my gosh, this sounds like a bunch of crap. I can't believe I wrote this. And then I would go and I would, okay, no, I have to go and rethink. But because I've got metacognitive knowledge about where I'm good at and where I'm not good at, it helped me a lot. So I'm very good at analytical thinking. But sometimes because I'm so good at analytical thinking, I will almost get lost in the details and I would kind of say too much with the same words in 7 different ways. So that is what will help a student as well with this. So I think the more we engage students through these conversations and discussions, the more they'll get to that. So we don't want no learning. We don't want rote learning. We want meaningful learning. So we want them to really understand the depth of what they're doing. And I think that's where the challenge lies. That is what ChatGPT is pushing us towards that. Really not just teach, but facilitate through conversation, through storytelling, because that's how we learn.
Thank you so much for your time. I am always amazed at how quickly an hour can go by when it's just engaging information. But we are at our time to switch over to our next presenter. So we appreciate your time, especially since we know it is your bedtime. If you wouldn't mind if you want participants to be able to ask any questions further, you can put your contact information in the chat. I know that many people will probably appreciate that greatly if you're willing to correspond after this.
Yes.
So we are happy to invite Dr. Will Miller to present to us next, and he's going to be talking about decoding the dilemma. Oh, I'm sorry. That's not what he's talking about. He's going to be talking about AI and the changing landscape of theories of assessment and relevant assignments and rubrics. So thank you so much, Dr. Miller.
Thanks. Hope there's my video. Thanks, Amanda. I actually am talking about the first one you started with, decoding the dilemma. So looking at AI crafted assignments, student responses, and then the potential that we could fall into a trap where we have an illusion of learning assessment as opposed to actually looking at learning as a result of what we're doing with AI. And again, it's a nice segue because I'm going to also get into ChatGPT towards the end and kind of show the potential power from both the faculty end and the student end that could lead to these larger questions from an assessment and a learning outcome perspective. A little bit about me and sort of where I'm from. As I've shared at the beginning, I'm at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and we're a fairly unique institution in the sense that we have 3 main campuses. So we have 2 traditional, what you'd expect to see sort of brick and mortar campuses, one in Daytona Beach, Florida, one in Prescott, Arizona. And then we have about 130 off-campus instructional sites across the globe, and then a full online arm for a total of about 35,000 students. And we have between associates, bachelor's, master's, doctoral programs, about 115 unique pieces today, and faculty that run the gamut on embracing AI, on using AI. We have faculty that have been using AI from an industry perspective for decades before it started this trickle down. But really an opportunity to share from a couple of different perspectives how we've seen this being used and how we hope to impact its use for better in the future. And when we think about higher ed in general, before we even get into the AI perspective, we always show this laggard curve, and AI is no different without maybe a question of trust built in over all of it. But we know we have the early folks, and again, if you're here talking about it, we're somewhere in that enthusiast visionary stage. We'll have the people that'll pragmatically come in later and are impacted by what we learn here and what we share. We have the folks that'll be a little more conservative, they'll be skeptical, but then they'll work their way into sort of seeing how they can use this. And then we have the skeptics that, you know, may or may not ever use it. We have the folks that in higher ed especially, or I have faculty that tell me, you know, I'm 4 years from retirement. I'm just gonna sit this one out. I can make it 4 more years. I can get through those classes. It's not something I'm going to take time to learn or master. And we know that we have to work with that. So it's there, but we also know that higher ed in general tends to make this somewhat unique. We're basically still using the same model and notion of higher education that started in, let's say, the 11th century, where we really started traditional lecture style. As we move away from it, it's still there at the end of the day. We're using a 17th century calendar, and you can fall into one of two camps. It's either for the farmers or the lack of air conditioning and weather, but one way or another, you know, taking summers off, I always like to ask my students at the end of spring, how many students are going home to help their parents with the crops, or the same thing for winter break. And we still stick with that. We're using 20th century infrastructure on most campuses, and we're doing it with 21st century students and technology that we don't even know necessarily what century it'll end up being labeled as. So we have this disconnect, and we have to face the realization that as an industry, higher ed has a tendency to be in that skeptic category on its own.
Dr. Miller, I don't mean to interrupt, although I am interrupting. Would you possible to zoom in a little bit? We've had a couple of requests to make it a little bit bigger, if that's possible.
Hold on, let me switch screens. I'll do that. That should make it even easier.
Thank you.
Play swap presenter and slideshow. Let's see if that helps at all once it moves over. I don't know if it did. Oh, now I have to actually change the screen too. New share. We will share that screen and see if that looks better for folks once it shows up.
Mother, thank you so much.
Perfect. No, I'm glad you stopped me. I wasn't sure. I'm on that second monitor is a little weird. But as an industry, we know that we tend to lag behind. And I think a lot of us acknowledge that, and we have our early adopters, but overall industry moves first, then higher ed sort of shows up at some later point. So in reality, that laggard scale moves all the way to the right to us, where by the time that other industries in other areas, especially with technology like AI, are starting to get their skeptics on board, that might actually be when our enthusiasts are first finding out and really figuring out how to make this work in an educational setting. And there's lots of reasons for that. There's, you know, it's a whole different discussion in a lot of ways, but not something that's as important for today. And then we think about, how do we end up seeing higher ed change, knowing that we might be a little bit slower to the game, we might be a little bit slower to the party on some of these things. My background's in political science and public policy. I'm a huge believer in what they call punctuated equilibrium. If you're on the evolutionary side, you're there too. But the idea that we sort of go along, the cruise ship stays afloat, and then we have critical events that happen across time. And during those critical events, we tend to take the opportunity to really look at things, to introduce new pieces, to make differences. And those critical events can be, you know, small, they can be big things, or, you know, in our most recent case, they can be a global pandemic, which all of a sudden opens the doors to, wow, if everything's going to be online for a little bit, or we might need things to be online, we need to think about this technology in a way that maybe we haven't historically, or ways that we can use it, or ways we can make things easier or more directed or more beneficial to students and faculty alike, and start having conversations about how these things help us. You know, and I will say, coming from faculty experience, I'm probably no different than a lot of you. If the course is running great and students are reacting and I think they're getting what they need out of it, something has to happen to make me sit there and say, let's take 4 months and really redesign this meaningfully to get it to where it could be. You know, natural human instinct is keep it going if people are responding in a positive way. So we need to take advantage of these events, and a critical event in my eyes is the introduction of AI and what we've been discussing with students, with faculty, with administrators, with accrediting bodies, with politicians, with everybody impacting our campus over the last 2 years of what this means and where this looks like it's going to go. So if we enter AI to this, and this quote's from Mark Cuban, of all places, talking about the fact that he thinks the world's first trillionaires are going to come from the people who master AI in all its derivatives and apply it in ways that we've never thought of. And we know folks are trying to do this in higher ed. I am sure that all of you, like me, I would say, 5 times a week, I get an email from a company I've never heard of that has something they can do with AI to make my life easier as a faculty member, as an administrator, as a something related to higher ed today. And we see that proliferating as people try to gain market share and help us understand what this can do and help us get past the trepidation that many of our campuses share. But we know there's significant areas of impact here. Not too long ago, Microsoft Research and Times Higher Ed put together a really nice study that looked at this and really looked at AI strategy. You know, they found that fewer than 20% of schools had a current AI strategy, even though more than 60% were planning to develop one. And again, that's perfectly understandable with where we were in use and where we were with understanding. Universities found it difficult to recruit and retain staff able to teach and research in AI. So if you've got from a retention standpoint of faculty, it's another one where you compete with industry. You know, they can either stay and teach students about it, or they can go to industry, probably triple their salaries and actually use the skills. So that's been a battle. Same study found that it will increase employers' demand for university graduates. And this was an important one. I mean, if you remember when the AI piece first hit, it was a lot like when MOOCs first hit. And that idea of, you know, could this be the downfall? Could this lead to jobs being lost? Every time I introduce something that's AI-based, there's some trepidation by somebody on, well, if it can do that, then why do you need me? But in reality, employers have shown us over and over already that it really means finding graduates that are capable of working with and applying AI as opposed to replacing off of the AI side. Then the idea that it'll be able to assess students, provide feedback, and generate test scientific hypotheses at least as well as humans can. That's where a lot of the focus is going to be here in a few minutes as we kind of show what's possible there and work to figure out how do we make sure in an era of AI that what we're doing for assessment is actually measuring authentic assessment and not simply giving students the opportunity to show us that they have been model trained and can continue to apply that model application. So how do we make sure we get to that part? And then obviously the fact came from the research and Times Higher Ed study, universities will not cut teaching, research, or administration staff and may even actually end up recruiting more. In terms of where can it hit and what the impact looks like, there's all sorts of areas. And this came from that study from Times Higher Ed and Microsoft. Really 4 quadrants to think about. The first and probably the most important for our conversation, the purple up towards the top right, the teaching and learning side. What can we do from a learning management angle? What can we do with collaboration? What can we do with learning spaces? What can we do with future-ready skills? Let's call it the greenish teal color on the student success piece. Obviously, an area that we've seen a lot more of AI injected into higher education early on. The recruitment, the retention, the completion, the engagement side, proactive, reactive AI text bots, the ability for conversations to happen using knowledge bases and not needing individuals to jump in early on, the ability for students to reach out 24/7 and instead of having a help desk to respond, being able to use well-trained bots, all playing a role. And then 2 areas that I would say are even lesser studied today, but will be coming. The academic research side in blue at the bottom. Again, collaborative research, the enablement, high performance computing in a way that we're not used to in higher ed potentially, at least not on most campuses. And then the orange, the secure and connected campus, which really gets into how can AI help us operate in a more efficient and effective manner, whether that means security, facilities, institutional operations, all of those pieces. So, you know, we have a lot of different areas. We're going to focus in on the assessment side as we get going and really think about where it is. And a lot of this ties back to the earlier presentation in a pretty meaningful way. We sync up pretty nicely. When we think about the reality of artificial intelligence and assessment, we know there's formative capabilities here. The idea of being able to get to individualized assessments, we've seen. We'll talk about that in a minute. I demoed a tool last week that actually would take in lecture live as a faculty member lectured and produce AI-generated assessments for the students during the lecture. So the faculty members not having to sit there and kind of pre-write the formative questions. The AI is actually picking it up as they present and writing the transcript and kind of posing those questions and then putting students on, you know, different paths based on how well they answer, how quickly they answer, all of those pieces. The idea of auto scoring, which we saw a little bit in ChatGPT in the last presentation, showing sort of what it can do with Blooms. But the fact is, AI, and we'll show it in a little bit, can write a rubric and then it can apply a rubric. And it can do that to different levels of satisfaction to faculty, but it can absolutely be used in that case to reduce faculty workload or provide faster feedback to students. But it comes with giving up an element of control that we'll talk about how we may or may not be ready or willing to do. As we've seen already today, ChatGPT, they can write outcomes, they can refine outcomes, they can help you move up or down a Bloom's level appropriately. It can help draft assignments. It can provide faculty lecture notes. I have friends that adjunct at multiple institutions that more or less go to an AI tool and say, get me a shell for this lecture, and then I'll go in and fill in the details, but help me at least get prepped for this. And it can provide study aids for students. And it can include in those study aids being able to craft for students those individualized formative assessments that they want. If a student uploads in ChatGPT, here's 2 weeks of notes from my American government course that I've taken, write me 30 multiple choice questions, and then let me know what the answers are after I provide them. That's all doable. But it does come with that trust that we don't necessarily see the back end. And most importantly, as much as we talk about this like it's brand new, it's not. If you think about it, just go off these three. Cengage has had Applia for 7 years. MyLab's been in existence for more than a decade. Connect's been there for 8 or 9. And all of these have based themselves and sold themselves as students can come in, and if they miss a problem, we can give them additional problems to help them figure out what they're missing and show that they're on path. But as the earlier presentation talked about, it really was a lot of formalized model training, where it would give students new numbers to the same problem, but the steps would be the same. And that question of, can the student successfully go from that more or less testing into that exact question and take that and apply it out. And it's really funny timing to have this conversation. Yesterday, I was talking to our Dean of Arts and Sciences, who happens to be a physicist, and I was sharing how much and again, I'm sure there's physicists on this call. I hated physics in high school. I didn't take it after high school. It was intentional. It was not my thing. I knew it wasn't my thing. And what I was exactly pointing out was I could, force myself to memorize the practice problems. I could do those no problem whatsoever. And if a practice problem showed up on an exam with new numbers, I was golden. If the theory behind the practice problem showed up in a different format on that exam, I was helpless. I could do the formula. I didn't know what it meant. I was missing the big picture piece. And that's the part that really changes, because if you really think about it, Applia, MyLab, Connect, all of these things that have existed for a while, it's really no different than a faculty member sitting down and just continually writing practice questions for students. We just took something that was being done very manually, digitized it, and now we have something that helps us hopefully get to that absolute next step. And we also have to remember that it's all about how we harness this. My background's in political polling and statistics. I don't like physics, I like stats though. And it's really no different than counting. Just because something new comes out doesn't mean we automatically lose the old. So if you think about counting, if you think about statistics, at the end of the day, the heart of it is counting. We start counting in elementary school, sitting there counting with our fingers. Then we moved away from counting, but now it seems that some of the K-12s going back towards, different types of mental math that lead to the counting. Eventually we got the abacus, we had math by hand, we had the old HP calculators. Now we have the Inspires that do all kinds of cool visual things. We have Excel that helps out. And we have ChatGPT that's going to do math for you. It'll do math, it'll write code, it'll do all sorts of different things. But just because ChatGPT can produce math answers doesn't mean we're not going to use Excel. It doesn't mean somebody's not going to use a calculator. I'm not sure how many people are still wheeling out the abacus to use, but I find myself still going back and counting on my fingers whenever it's convenient. So it's not about growing and forgetting. It's about growing and figuring out, what do we do with this? All of these have those distinct pieces today. We know to some extent where Excel is going to be most useful. We know where having a handheld calculator is going to be the most useful. We know where doing the math by hand might be the most useful. And we know where it might just be quicker to count, and applying those to the appropriate places through growth and working to really see where does that matter. And I think we are at that stage, but we're really trying to see where this works. One of the best conversations I've seen, and I really like how they present their conferences. This was from the U21 conference that was at McMaster in June. And they had a bunch of good sessions talking about AI and pedagogy and AI and higher ed in general, and how we assess and bring in learning analytics and student integrity. And they produced these kind of thought maps afterwards. But it's really that concept, and some of the key questions that are on this one that I think are important. Number one is the idea of, can we insulate parts of a university from AI? We're talking about it from a very faculty-centric standpoint today, but are there areas where AI makes more sense? And if there are those areas, is there a way to isolate it there, or is this something that's going to be sort of all or nothing? How do we change assessment? How do we scale it? With AI, the one thing I will say, it takes the amount of work potentially off faculty if it's used right. But I can tell you as an assessment person, then I sit there and I'm like, well, heck, if it's going to be easier, let's assess everything all the time, which means there's going to be more work and more problems and more things to talk through. How do students feel about it? Students have been very vocal at a lot of different sessions I've attended talking about their fears. And this goes back to predictive models and enrollment management of, I don't want a model to track me somewhere that doesn't really reflect where I want to be or where I could be or where I think I'm capable of getting. So they worry about the learning. They worry about standardization. And faculty worry about the fact that it might force us to reconsider traditional pedagogy. It introduces another element that is somewhat unknown that could change the nature of how we sort of do things. And that can all be an issue. So, I mean, we know these conversations have happened. And we know we've seen it. So if we think specifically about something like ChatGPT and assessment and this potential disconnect between the work students are producing, the work faculty are asking for, and whether it really mentions learning, there is an element of democratization that comes from something like ChatGPT, because again, this isn't new. The difference is 10 years ago, when we got into these types of predictives and these types of models, you had to know code to do it. You had to be able to scrape a website, build a scraper, write the code. You were having to do this individually. One of my mentors in kind of the AI space, and this would have been many years ago now, he was a political scientist, had worked in the White House, and was working debate prep for a major political candidate. And they wanted to scrape. Instead of doing the standard presidential debate tendencies of, here are 500 flashcards with everything that might get talked about, let's go. Their thought process was, if we scrape everything the moderators ever said, written, or produced, we can figure out what the 6 or 7 questions are going to be. We can just sit there and have the data tell us. So they wrote these huge models. They scraped LexisNexis. They scraped the web. It took them, it took 10 or 15 guys and women hours, days, months building up to this. Today, you could go into ChatGPT, and if you want to know what Candy Crowley talks about on TV, it's going to tell you. That part's already done. So it's opened it up in the sense that there's access for folks who maybe don't have the technical skill to do this. But with that has also come the fact that the technical skill side at least lets you know the context of what you're looking at and scraping. They knew when they wrote theirs in code where they were pulling information from, what was legitimate, what was reliable, what they liked, what they didn't like. Today, when we just go into how can I help you on ChatGPT in a few minutes, we don't necessarily know where it's pulling from. ChatGPT sort of tells us in the different versions, what were the dates? It tells you itself, I wasn't trained since January 2022, so this might not be the most reliable and I don't want to answer it, but we don't know. And we'll talk about that trust factor here in a second, because as a democratizing agent with the freedom to do this comes responsibility. So now all of a sudden in a political era and a societal era where we are growing less trusting of what we see and what we read, we now have the idea that, the Wizard of Oz metaphor of the man behind the curtain spitting out all of this great information that we're calling AI. But if I'm worried that Twitter's full of, bots that are trying to infiltrate our political beliefs, maybe that's happening there too. And now I don't know how to use it or how to trust it. So there's misinformation and then the misuse of correct information because of context. So this is from an MIT R.E. Harris poll, and this was done in February. And this is just asking 2,500 Americans, how comfortable are you with the use of AI for each of the following? It's basically, how are you feeling about data being used to make decisions? And you see 72% very or somewhat comfortable. Nobody has a problem typically with Netflix telling you the next movie they think you're going to like based on the stuff that you watch and where you stop movies and what you respond to. Facial recognition technology on my phone or other personal devices. Most people think it's easier if you can have Face ID. The irony there, of course, is, we don't like it as much when we're going through passport control and they're just using Face ID. We're worried that we've crossed a line. So personal convenience obviously playing a little bit of an impact in all of these different pieces. Half feeling comfortable about targeted advertising on social media, which also carries over in a lot of ways to, Amazon making recommendations on what else you should purchase, what else you might want to do. Less than half federal government benefits processing, so looking at Social Security, Veterans Affairs, Medicare. Less than half talking with an automated doctor about routine health questions. And then, 35% autonomous unmanned rideshare vehicles such as Uber or Lyft. And I'd just add here too, coming from where I do at Embry-Riddle, there's the potential for AI to fly airplanes. And it's that question of, would you be comfortable thinking that there's not a physical pilot in that cockpit? And would you know the difference, or how would you feel if you found out your plane didn't have a pilot that was manning the controls? So all sorts of things that get discussed, but recognizing that sense of distrust is at least prominent for some groups and for some individuals in different areas. So what are the pros and cons? And then we'll kind of actually look at what we can do in ChatGPT in these very areas. When we think about the pros, and we've talked about a lot of these, so we're not going to spend time just going through each bullet, but we have the ability to automate. We have the ability to make predictives. Predictive models shouldn't be followed blindly. I'm not a big fan of, data-driven decisions. I like data-informed decisions, but they can definitely help us notice trends in our data that we might miss otherwise. They help with natural language processing. I mean, if you're a qualitative researcher especially, AI gives you all sorts of opportunities to start figuring out what you're seeing in large batches of transcripts or written documents or qualitative responses to surveys. The learning analytics, the automation again, especially of surveys and feedback, being able to even give, I could take a session abstract for this presentation and say, what are 3 questions I should ask the audience? And it sits there and gives you a bunch of different options based on what you've provided. And typically it spurs further conversation and further ideas, and all those pieces. It can facilitate peer review. It can look at skill gaps. They can be virtual TAs. All of these making significant differences in where AI could help on the assessment side. But we know there's barriers to each of them. And the barriers are not insignificant. Start with the fact, we go back to the laggards, we go back to punctuated equilibrium. We know there's resistance to change. And this is a big change. This is a fundamental change. This isn't just a technology. I feel the introduction of AI is significantly different than, if we go back 20, 30 years ago and it's, let's bring in an LMS, or let's bring in polling, or let's bring in different types of technology. AI changes the game in a very different way. There's also a lack of awareness and understanding. We talk about AI sometimes in a way that's clear that people aren't necessarily, they're thinking things that aren't quite there, or they're thinking things that are more negative, and we have to try to win them over. Now, the data privacy piece is obviously real. We talk about assessing student work. We're uploading student work. How is that being housed? How is that being fed? What's already going on with all of these unique pieces to it? Cost, resource constraints. And in here, ChatGPT 3.5, you're not paying anything, but there's still a cost to figuring out how we're going to use it. There's still a human cost to the people that will be there to make this work more at scale, as opposed to just an individual class here, an individual class there. The integrations is obviously a huge one. The fact is the pure value of AI and the truest value is going to come from what it can do with things you're already doing. If AI is not being built into the LMS and you're having to export and import and do all of that, there comes a cost that's affiliated with that as well. The technical expertise, bias. And again, the bias and fairness piece comes back to, what the model's trained off of, but if the model is trained in an unbiased way off of data that is biased, you still have the bias coming across. So we have to be aware of all of these pieces sort of tying together. The loss of human touch, the limited customizations, the complexity, it's all there. And these are things you probably all heard colleagues talking about or asking about. The water cooler conversations that I hear, and I hear people talking about, especially when I talk to CTLEs, when I talk to assessment folks, one of the big questions starts faculty utilization. Like I said, we'll show you what you can do in a minute. But it is that question of how many faculty are actually making use of this? How many of them are in that stage that I'd call dabbling, where they try a thing here or there, but it's not necessarily a core embedded part of how they approach their classes? What are they doing with it? Why are they doing this? There's a big difference between faculty that are thinking, I want to look in ChatGPT to figure out how to take a multiple choice exam that has students looking at, and we'll tie it back to Bloom's, at a lower level of Bloom's on remembering or maybe understanding. And I want them to try something more complex, and I want ideas for an assignment that could maybe up the bar to a higher level, but still be appropriate for these particular students. There's a difference between that and I heard through ChatGPT I can stop grading papers. Let me upload them and have it spit out a score, and then I'll just move that right along. So knowing what the actual goal is. The concern about over-reliance. And my concern about over-reliance here is no different than any new technology. How many of you, when PowerPoint first came out, you get PowerPointed to death because everybody has a new toy, so we keep using it over and over and over again. And then when Prezi first hit the market, we all Prezied things because Prezi was new and we could go bigger and bigger and bigger. And now you have things like Gamma that'll do AI presentations for you. And I see a lot of those because it's new and cool. So we don't want to over-rely and just inject AI for the sake of injecting AI. We need to be injecting AI with a purpose and with a reason and with a goal that we can actually look and see where we're successful. There's implications with AI for student creativity and critical thinking. Graphic designers. My previous institution had really strong graphic design programs. And they were terrified of AI because AI spits out the types of work graphic designers used to take hours and hours to create. And all you have to do, if you're on social media now, I mean, let's start with, draw Amy who lives in Ohio and adopted 2 cats. Then, okay, let's add 4 more cats, and then let's add 8 more cats. And how's Amy reacting? And in the course of minutes, you see that image update over and over and over again in an incredibly meaningful way that takes work and limits creativity for other folks that are creative. The academic integrity piece, I don't even want to spend that much time on that, but we know this is an issue. It's ironic for me when I adjunct now. My favorite thing are the students who decide to only use AI occasionally for their answers to things. So it goes from 4 sentences of jumbled thoughts to a beautiful, bulleted, bold, sectioned off answer. And it's like, wow, this is clearly somebody helping you out here. And in this case, it's AI, it's not a person. The role of AI in shaping the perception of student competence, which we're going to definitely show and discuss. And then, the most important part I really want to talk about is that potential for model training to overshadow authentic understanding. With AI and that ability for students to get so much formative assistance, and for us to use it for so much formative assistance, it becomes harder to tell if they authentically understand or if they have just been trained into a particular way of thinking that gets them to the answer, but leads to them actually missing the higher level piece you might expect to see on Bloom's or other components. And then the disconnects before we get to the live demo. And this is just an important one to kind of just think through. We're already asked to focus on program outcomes. From an accreditation angle, they care about program learning. And we tend to use that different unit of analysis already, which is aggregated student performance. So if we already start with a mismatch where people want to talk about program health, but we're using individual student work on work that we assess as faculty or by program coordinators or department chairs, there's a disconnect there. And now all of a sudden, if that individual student performance is AI aided, how can we reliably roll that up and really tell what's going on? And how can we make sure that works? Although, and this is the important part of making sure we make use of it, and I think Jarek posted something in the chat that was around this, the growing and figuring it out. If we grow and figure out how to best use AI in these cases, it can actually be a positive in the sense that students, say a student goes in and says, write me a paper on blank, and it knows it can't blindly trust the AI, and the student spends equally as much time going through the AI generated paper and editing and removing the things that aren't quite right and adding its own context and adding everything that they see with it. There's still skills being gained there, just very different than maybe what the assignment the faculty member was hoping to have them working on looked like. And that puts a lot of faith on students. Everybody I talk to student-wise about AI, it's always, how do I make things easier? How do I make this quicker? It's not necessarily, how do I use this to improve? How do I use this to go to a deeper level of understanding? So we're still in that mindset where, and again, I'll blame us in higher ed that we haven't embraced it in a way to challenge students to see this as a tool instead of just something that's meant as a shortcut. So with that, I'm going to open up ChatGPT and just walk through some different things you can do in here. I think it's valuable to see it if you've never really went and looked at it. And I will make sure I zoom in on this because I know it's going to be small on that screen. But if you just start, let's just say I'm a faculty member. I'm a new faculty member and need a syllabus for Intro to American Government. And again, you'd think it would take more than this, but tells me how to do it, and then it spits out, here's a syllabus. And it'll sit there and lay out, here's my learning outcomes, here's the text. I will say in this case, the texts are actually legitimate text too. A week by week breakdown, policies, notes, whatever you might want. And then let's just say, thank you. I'm not great with the judiciary. Can you give me 2 lecture outlines for 45-minute class sections? Landmark cases, contemporary issues, conclusions broken down. So you want more detail, it will now add to the bullets. And just pull this out as we go. But where it then for me gets to the point where, and again, it's the part that scares me from an assessment angle, is it's done all of this for me. Perfect. I want students to do some type of assessment based on this, based on these lectures. What's a good project prompt? I could use that includes modern Supreme Court cases. Again, it's going to be a little stuck behind just because of when it trained last. And then it lays out, okay, so we're going to do a case analysis post-2000. It's going to do current relevance and implications, presentation, 5 to 7 pages. It walks through all of these different things. How does it tie back to the course objectives? So it's already helping with the assessment piece. There's my course objectives, and there's how that ties into every single course objective through just AI. And again, you could drill these down further and further and further into more different pieces. Great. Can you give me a rubric to assess this project? Yeah. Just like you saw with the Bloom's example, here comes a rubric. Point breakdowns, whatever else you might want. Current relevance. And I saw Shawnee's comment in the chat, and I'm going to do exactly that here in a minute. Perfect. Can you write a sample student response to this assignment? It walks through and it does a shorter version here. You can tell it word counts, you can give it page counts, everything else you want. But just to really hit the assessment part, can you assess it using the rubric? So now it's scoring its own work on its own assignment. It goes through the strengths. What are the weaknesses? Third. Rewrite the sample to address all the weaknesses. Now that I've just prompted it to address its own self-identified weaknesses, I have weaknesses. So if a student goes in, puts the prompt the faculty member potentially uses AI to help write, It gets scored using a rubric by the same model that produced it. And at the end, it might look like the students really learned, even if they've gone through and torn this apart and found all of the, the issues there might be. But what Shawnee put, what would, in the chat, what would an assignment look like for this course that ChatGPT couldn't help a student answer? And this is when we get into in-class things. It'll bring up experiences once in a while. It'll bring up bigger pieces. So in this case, it's going through doing an issue, a constitutional analysis, a policy proposal, a critical reflection. Although I'm not going to lie, if you think about these things that it's asking for, choose a current issue, do a constitutional analysis using constitutional principles, write a policy proposal based on it, and then reflect. ChatGPT is going to spit out answers for all of those different pieces. And that's where it's the question of, the most successful use I've seen here. I have a colleague who teaches in political science full time. A lot of his work has turned into go into ChatGPT, have it spit something out, and then I want you to double the length and critique it. Talk about where it's wrong, talk about what it's missing. They're basically teaching them to assess others. And the difficulty we run into with that is it's great from a, again, higher level Bloom's perspective, but if the students don't have the base knowledge they need to be able to tell if this is right or wrong, they still get stuck. So it's figuring out how do we balance this. But if 30 students go in, look at AI, produce out what the AI generated assignment's asking for, and then we roll it up and say, oh, 80% of my students met the learning outcome, do we actually feel confident that they did? Not that we feel confident all the time today, even with maybe what we use, but this changes it almost completely. And again, you can tie it back. Okay, take the assignment rubric and tell me how to use it for programmatic accreditation for SAC-COC. So the WASC version. Notice it had to think there for a second here, and now it's going to tell me all about SACs. Map the rubric to relevant accreditation standards. These are really bad examples because these are not appropriate SAC-COC standards. So this is where it struggles. 6.3, 6.2, none of these deal with anything related to learning assessment. So we know we can still break the models, but don't you get better? This is actually the right standard. It just died 10 years ago and was replaced with a newer one. So we know that we have that there. And to Nadia's point in the chat, absolutely. The evidence that we have and that we put forth might look really strange. I mean, if you think about it itself, if you go back to the rubric, it gives us a sample student answer. But remember, the assignment asked for 5 to 7 pages, and they gave themselves proficiency on everything, and that is significantly less than 5 to 7 pages of writing. So just understanding that piece makes it difficult. Jane, your point about group assignments, I absolutely love. I mean, you're spot on. You think this might be able to even tell us how to do the group assignment or something, but and Sherry asked, yeah, Sherry, what I'll do is I will print out this entire prompt run and then go from there. And again, from a policy angle, I think it's interesting because, I will bring up the integrity piece a little bit. At a previous institution that I worked at, we were bringing in chatbots for AI. We were doing a lot of student interactions with chatbots, and all the conversations was around integrity on the AI side. So it was all on, are they cheating? How are they using it? Whatever else it is. And finally, our Title IX coordinator was the one who raised the point of, what type of status are we giving the chatbot? If a student at 2 a.m. drunkenly sends the chatbot inappropriate messages, are we looking at Title IX violations? Are we looking at things that fall into sexual harassment? How do we handle that? So all of this technology brings in all of these sort of new ways of thinking about it. But from the assessment side, it really gives us a lot to think about. And I will make sure that we get out the whole run of this messaging. I don't think if I share it this way, actually there, I can do it right there. I think this will allow it to share out. And if that doesn't, we can make sure you get it a different way. I just have one slide and then I want to open it up for conversation and leave folks a little bit of time. I know it's a Friday morning / Friday afternoon, depending on where you are. But with all of this in mind, it does bring us to that question of what do we do? What's the takeaway? And there's an element of this that really is we're all still learning this. I don't have definitive answers. But number one, I think it starts with acknowledging that there is an intersection between AI and assessment, both on the formative side and the more programmatic accreditation-driven assessment piece, and figuring out how that's going to operate. It's going to involve working with faculty on becoming effective designers. And in this case, it's not about necessarily making the courses look pretty or as functional, but figuring out how do we bring this in and integrate where we can, and how do we have this be part of the conversation? How do we emphasize active engagement for students with AI, having them work with this regularly, as opposed to something that they only see on their own or see at different times. We have to acknowledge the blurred boundaries and the ethical considerations. I work with a lot of faculty who want to just get to a clear black and white answer on some of this stuff, and it's going to be in the gray area for a long time. You know, my wife's an attorney, and I can tell you that, you know, I know all about the gray area, but this may not ever get to clear black and white. The technology may keep moving faster than any type of system helps us figure that out. It obviously does lead to question the implications of AI on true learning outcomes. You know, we need to be sure we're looking at authentic true learning, not just reinforcing model training. And another big 30,000 foot view issue here is that model training gets students the grades they want, so that's what they care about, versus we want true learning, which is a very different thing. And this just brings that further into the conversation, because there's a quick way to get to an A, but they might not have what they need later. And then lastly, the push I always make is collaborative dialogue. And I do think here, the collaborative dialogue has to include students. And I don't think enough of us are doing a good job of bringing students into this. We're trying to guess how students are going to use AI and what they're thinking. If we could sit down with students and say, you know, all these AI tools, how are you using it? This is a safe zone. What are you doing with assignments? How can we make it that this becomes a tool for success? Students will tell us. It's about making them feel safe and understanding that we want to figure out how to use this technology no differently than we had conversations decades ago about what are we going to do now that students have calculators and we can't have them, you know, maybe they don't want to do their math by hand on an exam anymore. So all of that is there. It just gives us more to think about. And I'm trying to leave us about 10 minutes and, you know, broader conversation on either presentation. I know they had to transition to me fairly quickly, but just something to get us thinking about that.
You did have a couple of questions that came up in the chat. Thank you, Alex, for moving your question to the chat. I had it pulled up on the Q&A, but you beat me to it. So Alex had the question of, is there an AI tool we can use to help quickly auto-assess batches of qualitative information?
Yeah, and Alex, that's one that if you want to reach out offline too, I can get you some. I need to pull some different ones. But I mean, any of the big tools, and again, including ChatGPT, you can dump comments there and it'll start categorizing things. I mean, the earlier presentation on Bloom's, no matter how you feel about Bloom's taxonomy or how well it's being used, what is really nice is I can dump, you know, 150 program outcomes and say, give me a general breakdown of how you would categorize these onto Bloom's, so I know without having to manually do it, what am I looking at on the top, what am I looking at on the bottom? It helps you with some of that root piece. So any of these will do it. There are some specially designed ones, and I am blanking on the name of the one I use the most, but I'll make sure I get it to Jarek for follow-up, and Alex, if you reach out, I can get it to you too.
Thank you. Yeah, isn't there? I think there's a little paperclip or showed up on ChatGPT, right? Or the file, right? So I think that's the tool, right? That you can use. Okay. Yep. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I would like to follow up also, Phil, if you don't mind. Well, if you don't mind, Alex, I'm sorry. There's just so many questions that come to mind. Alex alluded to this, you know, okay, what about the AI features in Zoom? That's true. It's kind of like, you know, our I suppose our private information is out there, and we are always going to, you know, that's always going to be an uphill battle. I think it's you know, then at the same time, you know, in the context of what Alex was saying, technology is changing so fast. I don't even try to claim that I know where I am in this universe, right? I mean, there's just practically all apps are just exploding with all kinds of different solutions these days, and it's just difficult to keep up. But ultimately, well, if you don't mind, there's one aspect of taking responsibility for our actions as we interact with ChatGPT. Would you mind just elaborating on this just a little bit? What's up? Because it's talking about the overuse, right, or over reliance on the tool. Yeah, I will ask all these questions, and these are all plausible answers. They all look good. To what extent do I need to go to make sure that they are accurate and that the outcome that I want are going to be achieved? Is this what I mean to say, really?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, and I think that's, if we go back to ChatGPT 4 is a little bit better, and people are in the chat are rightfully talking about some of the equity concerns there. But I mean, one of the easiest ways to flag students on the integrity side is ChatGPT will produce citations for work that doesn't exist. And if you're a scholar in the field and you look and you're like, they didn't write that, that doesn't exist. I mean, we know there are things like that, but I mean, overall, I like to check it. And I think there's even, ethical gray areas that I think about in my day-to-day work. One of the things that I love to use ChatGPT for is I will, I have an hour drive for work every day pretty much. So I have lots of time to think and talk. I can sit there and put out a bunch of voice notes on something that I want to see written into a conference proposal, or I want to see written into an abstract. And then I'll put it in ChatGPT to get a first draft off of my kind of abstract thoughts. And then instead of writing from scratch, I end up just editing the heck out of that. But it always makes me feel like, is this okay to do? Is this not okay to do? Is this the way I should be using it? It still ends up being everything I wanted it to be. And I work through and design and scratch. And, I'm sure if track changes on it, looks like a big red mess. But I do think, to your point, Jarek, I still always end up, even when I do that off my own ideas, like, did this reflect it right? Does this really capture it? Because ChatGPT, especially the older model, it'll tell you, I haven't been updated. This isn't a good question for me to answer. But then there's other times where it just tells you something and then you Google it and you realize that's not right. I mean, if you go into ChatGPT and ask it for things like, give me good quotes about blank, and then Google those quotes, you find out that that quote's about 60% accurate, but it has been tweaked fairly significantly to really make it different. So it's just always going to be, it's a different part of the researcher tool set now, of the skill sets we need to have. And again, I'll say it's one that it concerns me from an academic perspective, because to my knowledge, I haven't seen any PhD programs yet that are doing a better job of teaching their soon-to-be graduates to teach, let alone, thinking about how they're going to use AI in their jobs or in their doctoral programs, or using this as a tool that has a lot of power. So I think we have growth to do there too.
So if you don't mind, there is an interesting, at least I find interesting comment that Vernon just made, as language-based model, ChatGPT doesn't have this sort of metacognitive awareness. And it's true. It's just that, well, if I could perhaps kind of like spin the conversation and like turn it around a little bit, in a sense that, when I'm talking to you as an expert, let's just say you're just one human being with this limited capacity for what it is that right? I'm going to, kind of like it's just given. We take it for granted. We talk to each other all the time. Maybe that's why we have conferences, right? So that we have many minds speaking to a topic of interest. But when it comes to ChatGPT, we have this entity with access to gazillion of artifacts and pieces of information. So its statements are just probably in many cases much more plausible. So it's true, but that ChatGPT is not going to generate anything that will contradict what it knows. Human beings could probably do that, but why do we question it so much? Why does it matter for practical purposes? I mean, you just demonstrated to us, the syllabus is just hey, 3 days of your work in 15 seconds, literally.
Yeah, and I mean, there is an element of that. I mean, at the end of the day, and this is the part that makes it tricky for me, I could use that syllabus, I could use those lecture outlines, I could use those assignments. If you believe that what happens in the classroom matters, the student may still get everything they need, and I might have saved myself a whole bunch of time. I don't think we can deny that, and that does bring in the larger point of, you know, at that point, if I'm a student, it's, well, can I just go to ChatGPT and have it teach me, and it can score me and it can assess me and all this, right? Or any other type of AI. So I think it's, again, that thinking about what do we really want higher ed to be? How do we want students to experience? What are the goals for what they get out of it? And that tends to be a little bit different. Vernon, I'm curious for your thoughts because I've enjoyed your chat comments.
No, I just that comment was specifically to the question of can ChatGPT create a prompt that it can't answer, right? It's not going to be able to handle that, just because of the type of language-based model it is. But I like the last conversation here of where this is going. And I really like the idea of using ChatGPT and helping students understand how it can work as a teaching assistant. I think that is fantastic. And these conversations always make me think back to a book that Richard Dreyfuss wrote in the 70s, when this was the beginning of AI, when he his book was called What Artificial Intelligence Can't Do, or something like that. And he had a couple of editions of that. And the bottom line of that is nothing matters to a computer, right? It doesn't have any stake in the game. So I think I would say that higher ed is kind of moving us in the direction of sort of handling those levels of Bloom taxonomy, but then it having that reflective piece where students have to reflect upon what this means for them as a person who's developing and learning with goals and interests and values. And so from that, you know, that seems to be very sophisticated levels of learning, but I think now the challenge is how do we scaffold up to that so it's a meaningful response, it's an authentic response, and it's not necessarily something that ChatGPT is going to produce in the specific individualistic ways that we're looking for.
No, I like that a lot. And I mean, I think the push and move to reflection is such a positive for us. And I mean, I can see that even in my role looking at large scale assessments. I mean, we have a quality enhancement plan that involves student writing. And as much as I enjoy reading the student writing projects, the value of that entire experience is when they have to sit there and reflect on what they're doing and how it ties back to writing growth. So much, because, and that's, you know, those are also, what's great is those assignments are the clearest, where you can tell, like, this is this student talking about their experience unaided by anybody else, and really doing that development piece, because that's always been from a learning side. I mean, that's probably my favorite research area, are the ones where, you know, faculty tell us 80% of students met an outcome in a course, and then we get the end of course evaluations and only 30% of students felt like they made any progress on it. Where's the disconnect? Why are we not worried that students are telling us they didn't make progress, even if the faculty member thinks maybe they have? So we have all of those components we can look at, and reflection, I think, really drives that side in a way nothing else will.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, well, all good, great points about, again, growing and talking. So I'm just so very grateful for our presenters and participation. Will, thank you. It's been great. We'll stay in touch with you. This is just an ongoing discussion that you know, absolutely we all can contribute to. So thank you very much for joining us. Well, the next week we are going to have our grand finale for the semester. So please join us. I hope you will. We are going to be talking about the skill gaps between what it is that employers expect and what higher education can deliver, and what's the role of AI. The final thought about the Khan Academy, Khan Amigo thing. Yeah, do check it out. It's just fascinating. It's really, if there is a tool that's going to replace the teacher, I think that's the beginning of that discussion. So here we are. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Dr. Janio, for your great
yes, go ahead.
as always. Thank you, sir.
Alrighty, take care. Thank you very much, all.
All right, thanks.
All right.